So tonight we have with us Cheryl Gillespie, and she is here representing the 5 authors that wrote Compassionate Journey, Honoring Our Mother's Stories. And so she'll be sharing her experiences writing that, and she also has her own book that she'll be talking about as well. So I'm going to pass things over to Cheryl so she can talk about her experience writing her books.
Okay, thank you. Over here on the side, we have a poster of the mothers that we're talking about. The lady in the center is Jane Sloven's mother, Natasha. Over on the lower right is my mother, Grace, who is also on the cover, who was me in about 1957. Above her is the lovely lady Effie, who decided as an adult to call herself Donna because she got into acting and did the Chautauqua circuit and so forth and so on. Over on the top, on the right-hand side, her Canadian name was Sue. Her Dutch name I can't pronounce, but anyway, that is Jenny Radsma's mother. And then down below it is Ellie, and that is Maggie Butler's mother. We all had been, before we met, writing different stories very often about our mothers and so forth, but we actually all met, the 5 writers, at the Glickman Library at University of Southern Maine in Portland, at a workshop sponsored by, you all said, by Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, MWPA, which is a great resource for writers if anybody's interested in that in Southern Maine and the rest of Maine, although a lot of people are down in the Southern Maine area. And it was about trying to talk about your mother in a realistic way. We all brought photos, and as everybody answered the first prompt and started sharing, several of us went, oh my heavens. For me, it was an eye-opener because I always felt rather lonesome about all the anger and the angst that I felt about my relationship with my mother. And it was very cathartic to find out that there were others with similar feelings. And after the workshop, a lady by the name of Jenny Radsma, who is our Dutch Canadian writer, who also is the director of nursing at University of Maine at Fort Kent, suggested that we all start getting together and writing on a monthly basis. And believe it or not, we had about 12 people at first, and each month it got a little more intense, and a lot of people backed out. They just didn't want to go into so much depth with their relationship with their mothers. The lady in the upper right-hand corner was the only one still alive at that time, although she was very, very ill. The rest of us had lost our mothers. And I personally got really into it. I was encouraged to send away for my mother's hospital records from Augusta State Hospital. That was the public psychiatric unit here in Maine, from 1948, because I had spent my whole life in the cover-up. Mom was quirky, Mom was difficult at times, Mom was very bright, Mom was also mentally ill. Okay, but you know, nobody said that. I had cousins once I came out with this who said, we all knew, Sherry. And they, well, you remember that Joanne was at the lunch. I grew up with Joanne and Winslow, and they all stood around going, we all knew. And I'm going, you know, why didn't anybody tell me? And my cousin Minnie very bluntly said, because you were just a kid, you know, and that was that. So basically it ended up with the 5 of us. We wrote for 4 years. That was wonderful. It was like a therapy session, meeting almost every month. And if Jenny couldn't always, most of us lived in the Southern Maine area. If Jenny couldn't come down from Fort Kent, we would Skype her in. So we would have the 4 of us and Jenny on a laptop and so forth. We decided we wanted to publish. We spent a couple of years trying to get traditionally published. And we did finally decide to go with Maine Authors Publishing, a hybrid. collaborative publishing house, and that was a slightly different trip. That wasn't quite as cathartic as writing together. 5 women, and I'm the next to the youngest, so 5 women around my age doing business together. That was a different experience, but we've made it through. And at this point, we've sold over 800 books. We've been on 207 with Amanda Hill. We have been on Maine Calling with Jennifer Rooks. That was really fun. She's wonderful. And so forth. And I'm here tonight to share a few pieces from this. And then from that, I still had cousins and nieces and nephews saying, but what about Gracie? My piece in here was a little less than 40 pages, and it really was just a little brief outline of what had happened to my mother and then how it affected me and my daughters and so forth and so on. So I said, well, I could write another one about my mother and go on and on. And I had started one in 2000. A chronological biography, but I decided to switch it up a little bit. And so I have written a book and have just published last month. It came out October 1st, about Gracie and Albert, and it's about my mother and father, and it is about the 4 months. My mother was in Augusta State Hospital. She was 23. My 2 brothers were around. They were 1 and 2.5. She was, and my father was 24, and after several difficult situations, she spent 4 months there. And it starts with the day she went in, and it ends the day she goes out. But anyway, to start with Compassionate Journey, the 5 very, very different essays, some very sweet, some rather edgy, and so forth, hopefully blend together and offer something for all kinds of different people experiencing any conflict or dysfunction in their family. And I have noticed in doing reading, some people will really key into the woman who was an Irish adoptee. Other people will really connect with the lady whose heritage was Russian Jewish folk, escaping anti-Semitism and so forth and so on. So there seems to be a little something for everybody. So I'd just like to read, in the back we have also one of our people, Maggie Butler, in her retirement from being a psychotherapist. There were 2 psychotherapists in the group. You can imagine they spent a lot of time studying me. But anyway, Maggie was also a writing instructor and a published and rather accomplished writer herself. And she wanted to put in the back what she called a toolkit. We wanted discussion questions, and I was all busy writing those, being the little teacher and so forth. But Maggie wanted explanations of how to form your own group, bylaws and rules for such a group. And then there's a bunch of prompts for anybody who would like to start writing their way out of some of their own mother-daughter angst, or it really could be translated into, relationship father-son, and so forth and so on. So it is not only an anthology, but it is also a little bit of a writer's guide, if you will. Okay, so I would start off with our delightful writer Martha. This was her mother. She was an actress. Martha's grandmother was a suffragist, Bondi. And all 3 ladies, including Martha, who wrote this, all married later in life, so they were kind of rebels as far as not wanting to settle down and so forth. But much to Martha's dismay, both her mother and her grandmother, as soon as they were married, became very submissive and adhered to a wife's role and so forth, whereas Martha questioned that. But anyway, and I'll repeat, Martha was an actress when she was younger, so when she does this, and she's tall, a tall lady, so she does this very stylishly. So I won't do it justice, but this is something that Martha wrote in her section entitled Sunday's Child. Our family, like many middle-class households in the 50s, was governed by rules reminiscent of the Victorian age. The adults were the big people who made the rules and decisions. The children were the little people, and they were expected to follow the rules and abide by the decisions. There were not to be broken rules and clear expectations. Mother made it clear to me that I was expected to get good grades in high school, so I would be accepted to a good college where I would meet respectable and intelligent young men from good families. If all went well, I would fall in love with one and marry him. One of my mother's favorite aphorisms was, "It's just as easy to fall in love with a rich man as it is with a poor man." I heard this saying so often that I deliberately went out of my way to hang around with guys who didn't have any social status. The topic about which we knew the least was sex. I think most of our mothers steered away from discussing sex because their mothers hadn't discussed it with them. Perhaps they also felt if they didn't talk to us about sex, we wouldn't experiment in dark cars late at night by the lake. My mother never mentioned sex to me, and even on the day that I married at age 27, she turned to my oldest sister and whispered, "Does she know everything she should?" Smoking cigarettes spelled glamour to us in the 50s. Our parents disapproved, even though they themselves smoked. My mother looked so sophisticated, gesturing with a cigarette in one hand and a drink with the other, that I wanted desperately to look just like her. So I learned to smoke, but I couldn't do it in public because someone my parents knew might see me and tell on me. As children, we didn't recognize the hypocrisy of the do as I say, not do as I do world in which we lived. We just knew we'd better not get caught puffing on a Pall Mall or sneaking a sip of sherry. No discussion was needed. The big people, little people dynamic was so well oiled, it drew the boundaries around my early relationship with my mother by setting limits. It also curtailed emotional involvement that I really needed and wanted, and I didn't get to know my mother until I was much older. And so that is Martha. Martha talks a lot about growing up just before the social revolution. She calls the rest of us who are 10 or more years younger than her the hippies. Okay, and she was a beatnik and so forth, and she reminds us that it did start with her, not us. Okay, they started the revolution. But anyway, that is Martha. Jenny's mom was still alive when we first started writing. She passed away, I think, about 2013 or so. And her essay uses an interesting vehicle of receiving a phone call that she was gravely ill. Jenny lives in Fort Kent. Oh, there it goes, Deb. That broke it at supper tonight. But anyway, we'll make do. She traveled to Calgary, which is way on the other side of Canada, if you know your geography. And she uses the vehicle of traveling to her mother's to be driving along and thinking back about all the different things that her mother went through and so forth. Her parents were Dutch immigrants. Her father was a devout Calvinist. And if you know anything about that religion, it sort of set them apart because it was the type of religion that was so stern that it ruffled other people's friends and neighbors' feathers and so forth and whatnot. But anyway, so this is Jenny. Among the keepsakes on my mantle in Fort Kent is a silver tin, a gift Mom received from her mother in 1948. Likely a wedding gift. She kept loose tea and a silver spoon in it. And although Mom got in the habit of using tea bags just as her Canadian neighbors did, once in a while she craved a real cup of tea. Then she'd spoon some tea leaves from the silver tin into the teapot, pour in the boiling water, and after steeping it for a few minutes, begin to sip a steaming cup of tea. One day in August of 2010, after we came back to her apartment and following a doctor's appointment, Mom made me a cup of tea, which in retrospect I realized was the last time she did so. I resisted the initial urge to take over, agitated at first because I knew I could prepare the tea more efficiently and be on my way sooner if I did. But I really had nowhere to be at a certain time, no calls on my time, so instead I sat on the couch, allowing Mom to make the tea in the familiarity of her kitchen and willing myself to relax and enjoy this time together. We chatted as Mom puttered about, waiting for the kettle to boil. She told me that Julie, a friend, had been by a few days before and left her some Dutch news magazines. In time, and with careful steps, Mum brought the tea tray, the cups rattling slightly in their saucers from her unsteady hand. "Do you want something with the tea?" she asked. Without waiting for my answer, Mum made another trip to the kitchen to offer me some spice cookies. It was so ordinary an event, drinking tea in china cups that had survived decades of use. But I recognized that afternoon ritual of tea as an extraordinary gift. Months later, as Mum lay in the hospice bed, I, while sitting at her bedside during my visits, drank tea from a mug heated in a microwave, my way to linger with Mum for just a bit longer before I went home. And so it goes. The ritual of tea continues from one generation to the next to restore and sustain and to keep mothers and daughters connected. As I sip my cup of tea at home in Fort Kent, I am grateful to remember my mother and equally grateful to have been her daughter. With no children of my own, it's my niece to whom I will pass on the silver tea tin, and it's to her I will say over a cup of steaming tea, "Ah, it's so good to be with you." And I hope she, in turn, will say the same thing to her daughter. And with my lovely glasses. Only because this is being filmed, right? I'd like to just mention Jane's essay has a lot to do with her Russian maternal family side, even though Sloven was also Jewish as well. And just the whole idea of how the persecution complex was passed from one generation to the other, and she feels she still reverberates over such things and so forth. She also has an adorable section on the Borscht Belt and how the Jewish comedians were a source of catharsis for, all the Jewish troubles and so forth. And in her opinion, there's nothing like Jewish humor and so forth. Maggie's piece is a very sensitive piece about the fact that she, in the early 50s, was an Irish adoptee. Back when the Catholic Church in Dublin and other, towns around in Ireland were taking the unwed mothers, giving them shelter and so forth, and then adopting their babies to Americans with enough money to do so and whatnot. And she talks about the fact that often it didn't work as they thought it would. And she had a great deal of trouble with her Boston Irish family. A lot of substance abuse in the family and so forth. She did, as an adult, go back to Dublin. She found her mother, who wanted nothing to do with her because she represented the shame that she had when she was a teenager and so forth. But she met her husband, and now she is a dual citizen. She lives sometimes in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, and she lives very often in Dublin, Ireland. So she goes back and forth. And her essay is a rather interesting piece. And then I'd like to just read the first part of mine entitled "The Questionable Letter." The plump envelope sat unopened on my kitchen counter. After 28 days, I had finally worked up the nerve to send for what was in it, but not the strength to look inside. What if it wasn't there? The theory I had clung to for so many years would be blown to hell. It took me a couple of days to find a good time to open the packet. I moved it around in the house to several different spots. To the side counter by the refrigerator, to the dining room table. I waited until I was alone. These notes detailed the 4 months my mother spent in Augusta State Hospital, a psychiatric hospital in Maine, more than a half-century ago in the fall of 1948. They would be too emotionally upsetting to share with my husband or daughters, at least at first. That late summer afternoon in 2012, I fell deeper and deeper into this pile of photocopied papers for at least 4 hours. The stack began with my mother's involuntary commitment to the mental health institution. The clinical description of my mother, then 23 years old, was bluntly objective, with phrases such as body very undernourished but no vermin noted, though very untidy, uncooperative, spoon-fed. Handwritten notes from nurses were obviously not intended for the eyes of the patient's daughter. I had anticipated they would be hard to look at, but my reaction was much stronger and more visceral than I had imagined. I pored over interviews of my mother that were mixed with testimonies of close friends and relatives, including my father. Curt observations by a doctor were in a challenging handwritten scrawl. Careful records of weights and blood pressure readings, along with the shock treatments administered, were hastily printed by different hands on a single chart. Someone actually quoted my mother as saying, "I'm going to get out of this dishpan alley somehow." I paused and wondered if the inclusion of this notation reflected a medical person's sense of humor. A comical, naive description my mother gave to a doctor concerning her roommates not acting normally on the ward made me laugh out loud, and some of my tension eased momentarily. I hit the bottom of the pile after reading a letter my 24-year-old father signed for the doctor in which he promised to bring my mother back to the hospital if she showed any signs of regression. The one document I was hoping to find was missing, though. There was no letter signed by the psychiatrist verifying my mother's sanity. I had spent my life clinging to the notion that such a document existed. I grew up hearing about this official letter. What was I to think now? How could I resolve my feelings about my mother's illness? I felt betrayed. I had spent most of my adult life trying to unfold the mysteries surrounding my mother. We were not speaking to each other when she died in 1984. She called a friend for help instead of calling me the day she collapsed alone in her house. As she lay semi-comatose in the hospital for a couple days before she died, I was angry with her. I stood stoically at the foot of her bed. Friends hovering nearby tried to get me to talk to her. They told me even though she did not respond, she possibly could still hear me. But I felt I had nothing to say to her. My denial about her impending death was so strong that I drove home and called a center that provided constant care and asked about the availability of a spot there. I had always worried about my mother, and I figured I would continue to do so. I was genuinely surprised when I got a phone call telling me she had died a day later. I remained upset with her for a long time. I believed no one understood what I had been through with her, particularly in the last couple years of her life. My husband was probably the closest person who could best understand, but he was young with parents who were vibrant and still working. He had them to turn to, but I was at a complete loss. I was also pregnant with my first child. I worried about losing the baby as I had experienced a miscarriage a few months before. The odyssey of repressed anger, resentment, and grief I started traveling often consumed me. And I go on to talk about, discovering what had happened to my mother and so forth. As I say, I started in a neighborhood writing group in the 2000s and was trying to explore what had happened to my mother, who was born in extreme poverty in Windsor, Maine in the 1920s, and piece together things that I had understood, she had told me, and so forth and so on. And my older daughter in a Syracuse honors class in high school had this project where they were to research and write about some event that had changed a relative's life and reverberated through a generation or two. And in 1924, when my mother was about a month old, she had 3 older siblings. They were 2, 3, and 5. And town fathers came in, a minister and 2, they didn't call them selectmen back then, I just think they called them town fathers, came in and they told her mother they were going to take the children because the father was an alcoholic, abusive man, and enough was enough, and they grabbed the older children. Grace was not taken. The minister told the town fathers that they should leave her while her mother had a chance to wean her and they'd be back for her. And they never went back. She stayed there for 12 years. When she was 8, a little brother was born, and she didn't escape that until her mother became so ill she couldn't move, and people came in to discover them and so forth and so on. But my daughter looked up different laws, and she found that in 1920, a federal law had been passed called the Child Protection Law. And before then, it's like the families were sacred. People didn't interfere with another man's family, you know, in the sexist society that they had back then. But this allowed clergy and town fathers and so forth to go in what they considered severe situations and take children out of abusive situations. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the book Before We Were Yours. Okay, very, very similar situation, although my grandparents were illiterate, okay, but they felt they had just cause for taking them, and they were just taken, put up for adoption. The 2-year-old boy was adopted immediately. The 3-year-old girl was taken by a rather nice family. They never adopted her, but they were kind to her. The 5-year-old had a horrible time. I mean, it was a toss-up as to who had a harder time, her or my mother, Grace, who stayed with the abusive father. But anyway, you know, and...
So they didn't help your grandmother? I mean, so the mother's left.
And she was crippled.
The children are taken.
Right, she was crippled from polio.
Oh.
So she died at 42. You know, that was...
Where's Windsor?
Windsor is right outside of Augusta.
Okay.
Yeah, right on, they had basically a tar paper shack on Route 3, right outside of, it's not there anymore, and so forth. But anyway, so my daughter's contention was like that this had greatly affected her grandmother, basically, you know, obviously me as well. And then I did not realize until I really got heavy into this project how much it had affected my daughters. And actually on our website there's a podcast that my daughter and a friend do. It's called Snark Notes. And she really let loose with, you know, how I really didn't think that, you know, I was talking much about it. But, you know, her name, my mother's name was Grace. Her name was Kelsey Grace. When she'd act out, I'd go, "Ah, there's Grace," you know, and so forth. And like both of them and her older sister, Darcy, said there was this, because they never met her, you know, and my father had died before that, so they never met either grandparent. And for a while, to isolate myself, I really kind of estranged myself from relatives. You know, I had these 2 sets. I had like real relatives, but were scattered all over the place because some had different names because they were adopted, or they just used the foster parent names. And then my mother was taken in by her mother's brother in Winslow, where Joanne and I grew up. And she was kind of used as a nanny and a housekeeper. So I had all these people that I called cousins, but they weren't really cousins and aunts and so forth. And it was just a hot mess. but anyway, and so, and Darcy was recognized by Syracuse University for that piece because it was an excellent example of a very well-intended law that rippled down through, her mother's family. But anyway, from that, that has been interesting. The questions that people will ask, after, us talking about that. But from that, I decided to ditch the whole chronological biography of my mother because it was just dragging on, and it's just, and then this horrid thing happened, and then this horrid thing happened, and it's like, and so forth. And I was with a friend listening to Lily King talk about euphoria down at the Portland Library, one of those lunchtime things, and she was talking about going from character to character, one chapter being this and so forth. And I was with you, wasn't I? And I wasn't paying attention. Deb was kind of embarrassed because I had a little notebook out and I was going, this is what I need to do. I'm going to change everything. I'm going to change everything. And this resulted from it. And I decided just that period of time could be used as a vehicle to go back and tell some of those pieces that I had already so laboriously gone over in, comment and critique writing workshops with people going, holy Toledo, and so forth, and cut them down and fit them into therapy sessions for Grace. And Grace hung on, like the perfect child, won the Bosch and Loam Society, the first woman to ever do it in the state of Maine when she graduated from Winslow High School. And got married, had 2 babies, bang, bang, way too quickly, and things started falling apart with her husband's family, my paternal side, and she just bottomed out. She had a psychotic break after several suicide attempts and so forth. So page 1 is her going in a straitjacket. And I'd just like to read just a little tiny piece. And this piece was workshopped in all 3 different writing groups that I did, one with Debbie and one in Bethel and so forth. But anyway, she was sedated, obviously, to be brought in to Augusta State. And the first time she woke up, she struggled, so they put her out again. And this is in chapter 3, the second time she actually gains consciousness. Gracie opened her eyes and looked around. I'll keep quiet this time, damn it all. She could feel her arms were still tied down. She could wiggle her toes, but barely move her legs. There were other straps she couldn't see. The room she was in was cavernous, with unappealing green walls pocked by random stains and dings. A light hanging down from the blotchy ceiling glared in her eyes, so she turned her head to one side. It was then she saw the curious windows. Thick wire screens were inside the windows, blocking any chance of a decent view outside. The screens were held in place by huge screws. She'd never seen screws so big. Gracie tried to remember where someone told her she was. Was this a hospital? Is that what those screens were all about? God, there were no security window screens that could help her, she fussed to herself. It got in her head and couldn't be stopped. She needed thick screens installed inside her head. Chaos seeped out of her through her mouth, her eyes, and everywhere it could. It scared her. It controlled her. The sand dunes she had erected around herself to try to escape this horror also kept her from the world. Too many flare-ups for her to crawl over the dunes. She hid behind them. This presence was a challenging roommate. She tried to appease it by vacating her small shell, but she kept being brought back, damn it all. Couldn't the creatures on the other side of the dunes see she'd had enough? They wouldn't leave her alone. Life without them would be a breeze she hadn't felt in a long time. She was tired of trying to control it, trying to keep people from noticing it. When she let it rage, trouble pursued her. Better lie still, be still, so it thinks it's in control. Plan her next attempt to escape it, better than the times before, so this time she would be free. It's been too much to live with, too much to handle. There we are. And I have had people in the past ask about, oh, well, in 1948, that was what people sometimes referred to as the snake pit era and so forth. And I'm sure the hospital was not pleasant in Augusta. I mean, I've seen it. It's, you know, it doesn't look inviting and so forth, you know. But she was lucky. She went in at about the same time. A psychiatrist from out of state came in to Augusta. He was a doctor. He only had 2 semi-trained assistants, over 4,000 patients in 1948 there. But not all of them were psychiatric patients. Some were menopausal women, there was addiction problems, just a variety of things. My own paternal grandmother died there. She had cancer, and in lieu of a hospice, she was on a wing that they sort of used as a hospice in the early 1950s. And so that is where Ava Grant died. But anyway, not all of her experiences were good, but she did have the privilege of working with this doctor who obviously was very progressive for his time. And the old-fashioned diagnosis that he gave her in 1948 matched the diagnosis that psychologist gave her cardiologist in 1983 at Waterville, you know. So he actually had it right. Shock treatments were not kind to her head and so forth, but they did bring her out of her depression and psychosis enough to function most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. And he was so sensitive. He did things like tell my father once she was better enough, she should get her license because she was too smart to be kept in a house cleaning and taking care of babies. And he did. He got her an old junk car, and she went out and taught herself to drive, you know, and so forth. And so I would say, you know, he had, on the old campus, he had a building named after him. I don't obviously use his real name or anything like that in here. But anyway, so those are the books. Any questions that anybody would like to ask? Or I don't know. Yes, yeah.
What kind of influence do you think you had on your mother?
Oh, no one's ever asked me that. I was always her caretaker from day one. I would pretend to be sick and stay home from school, because if I stayed home, we'd watch cook shows and we'd have tea and so forth. I always felt responsible for her moods. I always thought I had to do something to cheer her up, to lighten her life and so forth. And my father was like the #1 enabler, you know, don't say that to your mother, you know, and so forth. So we had a little bubble around her. I don't know what kind of influence we had a very, there was a lot of conflict between us, because I got to the point where I got to the point where I had an outside life, friends and, you know, a boyfriend and so forth, and I didn't always want to be home taking care of her and so forth, and she'd get angry with me. She was furious with me the day I got married. My father dragged her to the wedding, you know, and so forth. And I was still very involved in trying to establish myself as a separate person and not her wingman in my 20s when my father died. And then all of a sudden I went right from that to bang, I was her caretaker, because my brother had escaped the state as soon as they could. One left at 19, and one left at 22. There was a Scott Paper Company in Mobile, Alabama. And instead of getting a job in Winslow, he went to Mobile, yeah, and so forth. So I don't know. You know, it was always like a role reversal. You know, one time when I was 14, she was in the hospital. I cleaned the apartment. She kept kicking my father out. She tried to divorce him 3 times, you know, and so forth. And she came home. I thought she'd be delighted. She was furious, absolutely furious with me. In her mind, I was showing her up because her 14-year-old kid could clean the apartment when she couldn't. And, you know, it was always a fight, you know.
Well, there's a label for it. It's called a parentified child. And therefore,
Yeah.
you become the parent, and you're right on the role reversal.
Right.
But the problem is, I'll just say this universally, not yourself, but
Yeah.
the child gets robbed of their childhood. In other words, they can't be a child. They
Right.
do all the things that children do, and it kind of gets truncated at that level. And so you're always reverting back in that regard, wanting to have that childhood you didn't have.
Oh, and I was rebelling against principals
Right.
in my 40s, in my 50s. I became a teacher, and I was that type of teacher who would stand up and say, "You are wrong," and stuff that I would have done at 15 if I hadn't have been my mother's caretaker. You're absolutely right. When I look back now at my career, you know, and I still hang with retired teachers, and they all go, "Oh, Cheryl, when did you cause that problem?" You know, and so forth. And so I did from time to time revert, you know, and become childlike again. Yeah. Yeah, that's what did you call it? Truncated childhood?
No, parentified.
Parentified
In
child.
other words, you're the parent, but you're still a child, so it's called a parentified child. Lots been written about it.
I'll have to research that. Remember that, Joanna.
And I'm thinking, when you were like 3 and you were picking your own clothes and arguing with your mother, I mean, you were in charge at 3, right?
Yeah. Well, half the time she didn't wear. She didn't, you know, worry about what I could have gone to the bus stop buck naked, and, and so forth. Yeah, and the thing very much. My older brother would try to be a little bit of a surrogate father, but it really wasn't his role. He kind of had his outside life, and he just escaped really young. Cars and girls and alcohol. Thank goodness it was just alcohol back in the 60s in Winslow, Maine, most of the time. In Vietnam, he got into other stuff. But my other brother, oh my Lord, to the day he died, you know, call me up, what do you weigh? You know, what are you doing about this? You know, and so forth. He not only took care of my mother, he turned around and take care of me because he didn't think she was taking care of me. You know, and so.
Does control ever get in your way with things?
Oh, what, me be controlling to others? No, I think just the opposite. I was the baby, so I just catered to everybody. Oh, you want to do that? Oh, okay. You know.
Did you worry about that?
I worried about my daughters thinking that maybe I was a pushover in my relationship with their father sometimes. To which they both said, "No, you used to holler at him all the time." And I said, "Really?" It's like, but yeah, I mean, you can't really sit down and study something like this and not think back and worry about this and and so forth. My mother was bright enough to break the cycle of physical abuse most of the time. I mean, she would get enraged. I would see her put her hands, she'd have to leave the room. and we'd all hover around, and then she'd start singing after a while, and we'd go, okay, we can appear again, but for the most part, she'd get a little physical with my oldest brother, but she never touched me physically, okay, and I think that's big. She could cut me into shreds in about 30 seconds with her tongue, verbally, watch your wallet. And I worried about that with my children to the point where I told my husband, as the girls got older, if you see Grace, come along and tap my shoulder. And 2 or 3 times when they were teens in the kitchen, he'd come along. Especially when I hit menopause. It's like, I can see Grace railing out of me if I get angry. There she is. And but it's interesting how it affects the relationships. It is. Yeah. Anything else that anybody would like
Which
to?
was the lady that drank the tea?
That's Jenny Radsmer, and this is her mom. Her parents were from Holland, and I think 1 or 2 of her oldest sisters were born in Holland. She was born in Canada and grew up in Calgary, Alberta, way out there. And I mean, she considers Fort Kent South. And she is in the process of writing. Her mother was very dear and tried to hold everybody together, kind of the saint type of situation. Her father was very stern, seriously devout, very to the point where sisters left the house and didn't talk for quite a while, and so forth. So she would like to write about him. She's been working on that. And
then the underneath that is the Irish woman that got adopted.
That's Maggie.
Maggie.
And that is actually her name. Her birth name was Mayred Butler. And the nickname for Mayred was Maggie. So Maggie Butler was actually the name she was born with. Yeah.
And then the middle lady was the
Natasha
the
Slovin.
Jewish Russian.
Russian Jewish. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds fascinating.
It was very, very fascinating work, just when you stop and think about the effect of the generations. Now, I don't know what you want to do time-wise here. I know you close by 7:30.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I would like to buy a book. So
Oh, great.
If
Okay.
you'd like to do book signing, that would be
Sure.
great. If anyone else would like one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
most people don't kind of get into the weeds of one's life. And,
Yeah.
It's a tough
it's,
story
because
to
it
tell.
has so many emotional ties.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, getting back to, males have more portals than females, unfortunately, in the family systems to escape.
Yeah. I think you're right.
You just,
Yeah.
unfortunately, don't have a good exit strategy as a young woman.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really think, I have done this in lieu of therapy. I did try
Like
to.
you said, you used the word catharsis early on.
Yeah.
You listened, and of course
Yeah.
that is part of psychotherapy, as you know.
Oh, yeah.
And so this writing has been a pathway. So
Yeah, I did try to go to a therapist after my mother died, and I was quite pregnant with my older daughter. A name was given to me by the guidance counselor after I lashed out at a principal in a meeting, and she was overwhelmed. She just sat and she said, this isn't about grieving your mother. Your whole childhood was a mess. She says, I don't know where to begin with you. And I got even more angry. And I had kept pages of an autobiography my mother was writing on Scott paper surplus, that green stuff that they gave away free at the paper company in Winslow. And it was written in green ink, so it wasn't the easiest to read. But anyway, she liked green ink. And I was living in Wyndham at the time in an old Greek Revival farmhouse. And I threw it in the wood stove and burned everything. Now I think, geez, I could have had some of her writing. Yeah, and
So were you an English teacher?
yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
And did she love to write, or was she just trying to work through her own stuff?
Oh no, she loved to
She
write.
loved to write.
I come from a family of writers.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Oh yes, my cousins like to write. My daughters both write beautifully,
Right.
although
Yeah.
they're both just doing it for business right now, not creative
Yeah.
writing. But
Excellent.
yeah, we did. So anyway, I do have plenty of books over here. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much.